and welcome to a new Getting to Know Japan webinar. Thank you for joining us, and a big thank you to our program sponsor, the Japan Foundation New York, for funding this series and for enabling us to put this on each week. Today, we are joined by Professor Tom Gill, who will be presenting on Fukushima and its legacies. Professor Tom Gill is a British social anthropologist and a professor in the Faculty of International Studies at Meiji Gakuin University in Yokohama, Japan. He is the author of 2 books about Japanese casual laborers, Men of Uncertainty and the Yokohama Street Life. Since April 2011, he has been following the fortunes of the inhabitants of Nagadoro, a hamlet within a village which was only reopened for habitation in May 2023 after being sealed off for 12 years due to the Fukushima nuclear disaster. He co-edited a book on the 2011 disasters, Japan Copes with Calamity. He has been lecturing in ethnic and cultural minorities in Japan for some 20 years. Professor Gill, it is a pleasure to have you with us here today. I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you very much, Amani, for inviting me on for the second time on this program. I think it was a couple of years ago. You had me on talking about homelessness and casual labor. But today you've asked me to talk about Fukushima and its legacies. So without further ado, let me dive straight into it. So, I never know how well people remember things that happened 12 years ago. Personally, I always remember where I was on March the 11th, 2011. Actually, I was sleeping on a futon in my parents' house in Oxford. My mum shook me by the shoulder. It was about 6 o'clock in the morning, UK time, and said, "Tom, I think you better go downstairs and watch TV." And it was very shocking. Just very briefly to recap, Japan suffered 3 strikes that day. Strike 1, 9.0 magnitude earthquake, about 40 miles off the coast of northeastern Japan. That is the strongest recorded earthquake in Japan's history and the 4th biggest in the history of the world. It hit at around 2:46 p.m. and actually the housing and infrastructure survived relatively well, Japan being very used to earthquakes. But what really did the serious damage was the giant tsunami, which hit the Sanriku coast between 10 and 50 minutes later, depending which points on the coastline you are at. At its highest point at Miyako, it was measured at 41 meters, or about 135 feet, and it slammed inland to about a distance of 6 miles or 10 kilometers, and between them, the earthquake and the tsunami killed about 20,000 people, mainly the tsunami. And then strike 3 was the nuclear meltdowns at the Fukushima #1 plant. Now, there are actually 6 reactors at the Fukushima #1 plant. 2 of them were slightly further south than the others and not in operation at the time, fortunately. Of the other 4, 1 was undergoing maintenance and was not in operation. The other 3 were in operation, and within a couple of days of the tsunami hitting, all 3 of them went into meltdown, although this fact was not admitted by the Japanese government until about a year later. That's a very quick sketch of the 311 disasters. For an overview of it, please check out this book I co-edited with Brigitte Steger and David Slater, Japan Copes with Calamity. It covers the earthquake, the tsunami, and the nuclear disaster. And that on the well, the picture with the man on his bicycle going past the ship is the first edition, and the one with the Shinto gate is the second edition. Anyhow, um, uh, unlike the earthquake and tsunami, the nuclear meltdowns have so far not been proved to have killed anybody except for a handful of workers who were actually in the plant when the disaster happened. Yet 12 years on, people tend to forget that the death toll was highest in Miyagi Prefecture, where about 12,000 people died. Then Iitate Prefecture, where about 6,000 people died. And thirdly, Fukushima, where uh, about 1,500 people were killed by the tsunami. And but nowadays, people say that around 3,000 people died in Fukushima because they add on what are called indirect deaths, people who died later as a result of the stress of evacuation and so on. This question of direct and indirect deaths is very complicated. You can ask me about it at Q&A time if you're interested. So here's my question. Why is it that that a lot of people tend to remember that as the Fukushima disaster, although that wasn't where most of the deaths occurred? Well, the Fukushima disaster, meaning the nuclear meltdowns, was a very different disaster from the earthquake and tsunami. They were natural disasters, whereas the people saw the nuclear meltdowns as a man-made disaster. In Japanese, the expressions are tensai, a natural disaster, and jinsai, a human disaster. And this is a very important distinction. It results in different answers to the question of why did it happen? You know, at the time of the tsunami, there were a few televangelists in the US who said that this was divine punishment that Japan was experiencing because not enough people had converted to Christianity. But that idea of divine punishment is very alien to most Japanese people. They generally shrugged their shoulders and said, well, it's a natural disaster, so it can't be helped. That was the view of the vast majority of people. On the other hand, in the case of the nuclear meltdowns, there was an obvious person to blame, namely Tokyo Electric Power Company, or TEPCO, and the government of Japan, which for many years had pursued a policy of building nuclear reactors on the coastline, a total of 52 by the time this disaster occurred. They have to be built on the coastline because they need huge amounts of water to keep them cool. But of course, that results in a tsunami risk. Okay, there were a few cases in the tsunami where people were blamed, such as the famous cases of elementary schools where children were not evacuated in time or moved to the wrong place. But by and large, it was seen as a natural disaster, whereas the blame is much easier to apportion in the case of the nuclear disaster. Incidentally, this also means that on average, people who were victims of the nuclear disaster have received far more compensation from the government than people who were affected by the tsunami. Another important difference is that, of course, the nuclear disaster is still with us. The decommissioning of F1, that's the shorthand for the Fukushima #1 plant. By the way, there is also F2, the #2 plant with 4 more reactors a bit further down the coast. that luckily were not damaged too badly. That's going to take at least another 30 years. And of course, there's the question of where to put all the nuclear waste. And recently, the controversy over the flushing of radioactive water into the sea. Let me just briefly tell you about my own research. For nearly 13 years, I've been studying the people of one small hamlet called Nagadoro in Iitate village, a population of about 250, who had to evacuate their ancestral homelands. And I've made over 50 visits to Fukushima and lived in Fukushima City for 6 months. So here's just a very brief outline. This map shows Fukushima Prefecture. I'd like to dwell on it just for a moment to point out that Fukushima Prefecture is very big. It's actually the 3rd biggest prefecture in Japan, and the area that was severely affected by the nuclear disaster is a very small part of the total. So that even immediately after the meltdowns, food from the western, central and western parts of Fukushima was perfectly safe to eat. Only people in what they call Hamadori. Fukushima Prefecture is divided into 3 parts. Hamadori, the coastal region, Nakadori, the central region, and Aizu, the western region. This is the village I've been studying, Iitate, and that red circle shows the 30-kilometer exclusion zone that the government eventually imposed around the nuclear power plant. Where lines are drawn on the map has fateful consequences. The Japanese government assumed, with no basis in fact, that radiation would spread out in a neat round pattern and evacuated settlements accordingly. And so this is why the evacuation zone, well, it started with being a 3-kilometer radius of the power plant. Then it went to 10, 20, and finally 30. But that's, you can see on this map here, the 20 and 30-kilometer radiuses. But as anybody who thinks for a moment will immediately know, radiation does not spread out in a neat round pattern. It depends on the direction and speed of winds, timing of rain and snow, and a number of other factors. And in fact, the radioactive plume did not look like a circle. It looked like a kind of baseball bat, and it was heading straight for Iitate village, which is this kind of shaped like a loaf of bread up here in the northwest part of this map. And the government knew this. They had their own very sophisticated warning system called SPEEDI, SPEEDI. They have monitoring stations all over Japan, which tell you not only how much radiation, what kind of isotopes and so on, but also wind speed, rainfall, and all the other factors. They totally ignored all their own data and just drew a neat semicircle on the map. Partly out of blind panic, partly because I think they didn't want to explain lots of technical stuff to people, and partly, well, what can I say? Sheer stupidity. It took them 80 days before they finally adjusted. This is the original 20-kilometer exclusion zone, and they finally adjusted it to include Iitate village, which, as you can see, was actually getting more radiation than some areas that were much closer to the plant but were to the south. And tragically enough, during the immediate weeks after the disaster, the government was actually evacuating people from these settlements around here to Iitate village, evacuating them to a place which had a higher level of radiation than the place they were leaving. How about that? It took them 80 days before they finally evacuated Iitate village, and that is a disastrous mistake if you consider that the main isotopes that were released in the Fukushima disaster were iodine-131, cesium-134, and cesium-137. Iodine-131 is by far the most dangerous one. That is why people are given iodine tablets when a nuclear incident occurs. It's very dangerous, but it has a half-life of just 8 days. So by the time they finally evacuated this village, which includes my own little hamlet, they'd already had 10 half-lives of iodine-131. In other words, any damage that radioactive iodine was going to do had already been done before they evacuated the village. Yeah, that was just one of the many, many very sad things about what happened in the government response to the disaster. Now, this chart here shows radiation levels at various locations in Fukushima Prefecture. And I want to draw your attention to the x-axis here. You can see it starts on March the 11th. The plants, the nuclear power plants, started leaking radiation about 3 days later. That's where you get this sudden spike up to, well, 20, 25 microsieverts an hour. That is a dangerous level of radiation. And then it's rapidly going down after that. And the end of this x-axis is March the 31st. So this is the first 20 days of the disaster. And it shows, again, how wrong-headed the government was to not evacuate people during this genuinely dangerous period and wait until by far the most dangerous period had ended and then evacuate people for years and years on end. Wrong-headed from start to finish. Here's a little map of my field site. This is Iitate village. It's not really a village. As a matter of fact, it has a bigger land area than the city of Osaka, but a population of 6,000 compared with about 2.5 million in Osaka. So even before the disaster, it was very thinly populated, and the Abukuma mountain range runs across it diagonally here, meaning that a lot of the radiation was stopped at the mountains and dumped on these 3 southern settlements of Hiso, Nagadoro, and Warabi Daira, and that's where the highest radiation levels were recorded. So that black box shows the Iitate village, and the red box shows Nagadoro hamlet, one of the 20 hamlets inside Iitate. And out of the 20, it alone was declared a hard-to-declare zone, and the people were forced to evacuate and were not allowed to return for 12 years. Now I'll just ask you a rhetorical question. What do you think the people from the other 19 hamlets of Iitate thought about that? You might think they'd feel very sorry for the people of Nagadoro who had been hit with a much higher level of radiation. In fact, no, they were very envious because they received much more compensation money from the government because of it. Compensation is another massive topic which affects the lives of everyone. If you were living in Nagadoro, you'd be getting north of 100 million yen per household. The rest of Iitate, you'd be getting probably north of 50 or 60 million yen per household. If you were living in Iitate, which is actually a district of the city of Date these days, which is right directly west of Iitate, you'd get almost nothing at all. And so this is one of the many, many very serious problems arising from the disaster response. Yeah, I think you've got the picture there. Yeah, and for many years it was the only part of Iitate that they didn't try to decontaminate. Instead, they dumped the low-level radioactive waste from the other hamlets in Nagadoro. Yeah, Nagadoro uh, alone was barricaded. Can I get this bar out of the way? Maybe that will be a little bit better. So for 12 years, nobody could get into Nagadoro unless they had a permission, government position, permission for the guardmen dressed in these full body hazmat suits to let them in. Right. And the people of Nagadoro and other parts of Fukushima that were severely impacted by the disaster suffered double discrimination. First, what I call kegare sabetsu, or pollution discrimination. People thought they were dirty through contact with radiation. There was a lot of unfounded fear that they could contaminate other people through contact or proximity, and that if you married, particularly if you married a woman from Fukushima, she might give birth to a malformed baby. There was really no foundation for this, but it was nonetheless very strong, especially in the year or two immediately after the disaster. And then that gradually gave way to what I call netami sabetsu, or envy discrimination, based on the unearned wealth that resulted from the government compensation policies. And despite the trillions of yen that the government has spent on decontamination in the last decade, only a tiny percentage, somewhere between 10 and 20% of the evacuated population has returned. And since most of them are elderly retirees, there is no prospect of these communities ever returning to their pre-disaster lifestyles. In the case of Nagadoro, I believe that none of the 250 inhabitants will ever return. Actually, I should have updated this slide, because one man, Mr. Ogura, is currently building a new house to live in Nagadoro. He's a brave man. As far as I know, he is the only person planning to live regularly in Nagadoro. Some of the other inhabitants may use surviving houses in Nagadoro as kind of holiday cottages, or for nostalgic visits to their former dwelling place. All right. Uh, I could tell you a lot more about my research, but time is running short, so I just want to briefly go through some of the frequently asked questions about the Fukushima disaster. First of all, is it safe to go to Fukushima? Except for the area in the immediate vicinity of the crippled power plant, it's perfectly safe to go to Fukushima and to stay there for extended periods of time, as I have done myself. And earlier this evening, I checked the current levels of radiation in Yokohama, where, of course, this is very rough and ready, because radiation levels vary quite widely within a big city, or even within a fairly small village. But anyhow, just ballpark figures. Yokohama 0.043 microsieverts, Fukushima City about twice as much of that, but still negligible. Iitate village, or one part of it, yeah, it is noticeably higher, but even 4.7, by the way, 1,000 microsieverts makes 1 millisievert, 1,000 millisieverts makes 1 sievert. 4.7 millisieverts here is not a threat to human health, even if you live there permanently, and there's certainly no problem going there for a visit. Okay, another question people often ask: how does Fukushima compare with Chernobyl? Well, they're two totally different disasters. In the case of Chernobyl, we had operating reactors exploding and catching fire. And the amount of radiation released into the atmosphere was far higher, especially in the case of the really dangerous ones like plutonium, strontium, which have very long half-lives. The Fukushima is a fraction of 1% of the Chernobyl levels. All the clinical evidence so far indicates that the Fukushima disaster has been a much smaller threat to health than the Chernobyl disaster, although many people will loudly disagree with me about that. Is it safe to eat food from Fukushima? It is probably safer to eat food from Fukushima than from any other parts of Japan because they are tested far more frequently and more rigorously for radioactive particles than in any other prefecture. And fourthly, is the discharge of radioactive water into the Pacific Ocean a threat to human, animal, or plant life? My answer is no, it is not. The amount of radiation contained in the water after an intensive process of decontamination is much lower than in water discharged from working nuclear power plants in other parts of the world. The only nucleids present in any significant amount is tritium, which is not a very great danger to human health. It's comparable to a little boy weeing into an Olympic-sized swimming pool. I know it sounds shocking, releasing radioactive water into the sea. And of course, the government of China in particular has made as much political capital as they can out of it, banning the import of all marine products from the whole of Japan, which is completely unnecessary. It's just political grandstanding, in my humble opinion. I just want to very briefly consider what would be the alternative to discharging this water into the sea. They have hundreds and hundreds of gigantic storage tanks which are increasing all the time. It's like the Sorcerer's Apprentice. You cannot just go on covering more and more land with gigantic storage silos full of very slightly decontaminated water. Suppose another major earthquake were to hit and they all ruptured and discharged the water all over the land of Fukushima, that could potentially be far more hazardous than what the government is actually doing at the moment. Hey, I hate agreeing with the Japanese government. They deserve criticism for many, many reasons in connection with the Fukushima disaster, but I don't think this is one of them. Hey, thank you very much for your kind attention. Now I will be happy to take your questions. There, half an hour dead.
Thank you so much, Professor Gill, for your wonderful presentation. I would like to begin with a question for myself. So in comparison to how the government responded with Fukushima, do you think that they have done a better job and they were better prepared, though it was not the same level of destruction per se, but do you think they were better prepared for this most recent earthquake that happened in Ishikawa?
Well, of course, the death toll there at the moment is 200, right? I'm just trying to figure out how I can get to see everybody again. Oh, there we are. Good. The death toll there was about 200, and which is probably not that different from what the death toll from the earthquake at Fukushima was. The difference was that this time there was no giant tsunami, and thank goodness the nuclear power plants on the coast of Niigata were not affected. One point that some observers have made is that people in poor rural parts of Japan are much more at threat from natural disasters because they have older infrastructure, especially those very flimsy wooden houses with their extremely heavy ceramic tile roofs, many of which basically flattened the house underneath them. But you can't actually blame the government for that. And since the disaster happened, I think they've been doing a relatively good job of handling the situation. But after all, it is several orders of magnitude less serious than what happened in Fukushima.
Thank you so much. Additionally, I wanted to ask, so there has been, since the Fukushima nuclear disaster happened, there's been a lot of conversations about alternative energy resources to kind of replace nuclear energy. In your opinion, do you think that it's necessary to replace nuclear power plants, or how can Japan go about finding a new energy resource without perhaps creating some kind of, in the instance that in the future a big earthquake happens or tsunami happens per se, we can prevent something like this from happening again? What do you think?
Well, Japan should definitely abandon nuclear energy. Um, in my view, you've heard me saying some relatively soothing, I hope, things about the results of the Fukushima disaster. It happened to wind up that way. It could have been much worse. It may be much worse next time. That tsunami, that earthquake and that tsunami were supposed to be 1 in 1,000 year type events. But hey, it happened just 50 years after Japan started using nuclear energy, which doesn't raise a lot of confidence. Okay, if it's 1 in 1,000 years, it could be after 50 years and then none for 950. Do you believe that? Do you feel happy to believe that and live in a country that's very prone to earthquakes and tsunamis and has its coastline dotted with nuclear power plants? So there's no doubt in my mind they should shut them down. I would probably, the ones that are not on active fault lines could perhaps be allowed to operate until they've reached their planned lifespan. But the one at Fukushima had already been given an extension beyond the 40 years it was supposed to operate, and they've been very casual about it. And they should use renewable energy. It's not even that difficult. I mean, after the disaster, there was a lot of talk about Japan becoming a world-beating leader in renewable energy. And yes, some solar farms have been built in Fukushima. They should have done a lot more than that. And the government has not been proactive enough, and they continue to pour lots of money into the nuclear industry, which to me is totally wrong. And you know why it is? I think it's because nuclear power plants cost a huge amount of money. They involve gigantic industrial companies, vast budgets. There's all sorts of opportunities for kickbacks for politicians. You don't get that when some chap sticks solar panels on his roof. It's small unit, individual level energy creation, and it just doesn't appeal to the Liberal Democratic Party pork barrel style of government. Anyway, that's my tuppenny worth.
Thank you. In the chat, Jason Gerber asked, so do you prefer coal generation over nuclear?
I didn't quite catch that. Prefer what to what?
Do you prefer coal generation over nuclear?
No, as we all know, there's a huge cost to human health from coal and oil-fired power stations as well. After the disaster happened, Japan restarted a lot of coal-fired power plants to fill the gap in their energy requirements. At the time, it was a stopgap measure. It couldn't be helped. They've been much too slow in getting away from their dependence on coal-fired energy.
Thank you very much. David Green asked, Is it true that the waters of the tsunami did not reach the reactors and therefore had no direct effect?
Um, uh, well, no, I don't think that is true. Uh, well, certainly the waters were high enough and strong enough to breach the flood defenses at at the Fukushima #1 plant. And yet another sad thing about this disaster was that the backup, well, famously now the the backup electricity generators were located closer to the sea than the reactors themselves, and so they were all knocked out by the tsunami, and that's what caused the disaster, because nuclear reactors need water to be pumped around them, cold water to be pumped around them all the time to keep the fuel rods cool. And so whether the tsunami, I don't think the tsunami actually smashed through the reactor house itself, but that's not really the point. They definitely melted down, or three of the total of six reactors there.
I just wanted to add a little bit of context. So in David's opinion, the entire blame falls on the installation of the generators below the level of the reactors closer to the sea. As an engineer, he cannot believe that this was allowed and that there was not a second set of generators higher than the
Um, Well, I basically agree with that. The design of the Fukushima power plant was quite disastrous, and that certainly did make things worse. Let me just open up the chat so that I can see some of this. But on the other hand, consider the case of the Onagawa nuclear power plant in Miyagi Prefecture, of about maybe 40 or 50 miles north of the Fukushima power plant. It was actually located nearer to the epicenter of the earthquake than Fukushima #1. It survived. The pro-nuclear lobby made a lot of it, that the Onagawa plant was closer to the epicenter, and yet it survived. And it was only the design faults at the Fukushima plant that caused the problems, and yet the Onagawa power plant had power plant had five backup uh, generators, four of which were knocked out by the tsunami. They survived by the skin of their teeth. We could easily have had two nuclear disasters in Japan. Um, you know, so yeah, I don't think that this particular design fault means that there's no problem with nuclear energy so long as you put your radiators, your generators higher up the mountain.
The next question comes from Christine Gubalt. So given that the Cesium-137 lifespan is 30 years, does it mean that in 2041, all evacuation orders will be lifted and there will be no more no-go zones in Fukushima?
Okay, well, so already the levels of radiation are much, much lower than they were at the time of the disaster, and some 90% of the evacuation zones have been reopened to human habitation. And, except for the area immediately around the nuclear power plants, which are being used as a temporary, but I think in effect permanent dump for contaminated waste. I think, yeah, eventually most of the evacuation zone will be reopened to habitation. Indeed, 90% of it already has been. For me, the much more serious problem is the unwillingness of people to go back and live in those areas, even though they are now allowed to do so. Shall I explain for a minute why I think that is? Or shall we move on to another question?
Feel
Okay,
free
so
to-
okay, so the government says, "Oh, we have decontaminated your village. It's now okay for you to go and live there again." When they say that, what they mean is they've decontaminated the area immediately around houses, shops, streets, and of course, shrines, graveyards, and so on. But what they haven't done is decontaminate the thickly forested mountainous areas that surround these villages. It's virtually impossible to decontaminate there. You'd have to chop down thousands and thousands of trees, and it's just not practical. And so it's really a decontaminated settlement surrounded by non-decontaminated forested mountains. And naturally, people are concerned that every time it rains or there's a strong wind, radioactive particles will come drifting down into the settlement again. I don't think that is a sufficiently serious problem to not live there, but people do believe it, and that's how it is. So, and especially people with small children. As we all know, children are more vulnerable to radiation because they have longer lives to live, and less defenses against it. So people with small children don't want to go back. Therefore, mothers don't want to go back. Therefore, fathers also will not go back. In some cases, they disagreed with their wives, leading to the famous case, the famous problem of nuclear disaster divorce. Families broken up because they view the dangers of radiation differently. But once the mums and dads and the children aren't coming back, that just leaves the old folks. And, they've had 12 years to get even older. If you can't drive and you're living in an isolated village with no shops or services anywhere nearby, and not in a nice three-generation family like you were before the disaster, but instead on your own because the younger generations won't come out. Well, little by little, even the old people are giving up on the idea of going home, which means that the trillions of yen spent on decontamination is largely wasted money. They should have done the same thing as at Chernobyl, declare the entire area a no-go zone, relocate people to other places, which wouldn't be that difficult in a place the size of Fukushima Prefecture. That was the road not taken. Very sad. I blame it on the Japanese ideology of people and land. That connection between the people and the land. The idea of that they could just live somewhere else was considered somehow disrespectful of the people, which is kind of strange because every year they do exactly that to thousands of people every time they build a new dam. But for some reason, the ideology works differently there. So I'll shut up and take the next question.
The next question comes from Vivian Ying. What suggestions do you have to improve public perception about the safety of food from Fukushima?
Well, well, you know, the national government and the prefectural government have bent over backwards trying to show how safe the food from Fukushima is, but they have to compete against social media, where there are a lot of people exaggerating the dangers of food from Fukushima, and well, well. That's a really tough question, actually. One thing they could maybe do a bit more is they could have more national politicians and famous popular culture stars going to Fukushima and publicly eating food there for their fans to see. But they have done that to some extent, and it's had only a limited benefit.
You. So Just Carlt, I apologize if I mispronounced your name. 8-year Fukushima resident here. Thank you for the concise but nuanced presentation. What was your biggest takeaway for your time spent living in Fukushima? And where in Fukushima did you spend the most time?
Okay, so I was living in Fukushima City, which is roughly roughly 60 kilometers or 40 miles away from the power plant, and I was an affiliated researcher at Fukushima University during that period. I made many trips to Iitate village, but actually most of the field work was better done in Fukushima City because that's where most of the people from Nagadoro and other settlements in Iitate are now living. And this is a very interesting point because so Iitate village is between 30 and 45 kilometers away from the power plant, depending on which part of the village you're in. Fukushima City is between 60 and 80 kilometers away, depending on which part of the city you're in. Many people evacuated from Iitate to Fukushima City. But at the same time, many other people evacuated from Fukushima City to Tokyo, Osaka, Fukuoka, because they thought that the level of radiation was too dangerous in Fukushima City. So this became a place that people evacuated to and from. In fact, I came across one particularly extreme case. One of my informants in Nagadoro refused to move even after it was declared a no-go zone, which, by the way, was over a year after the disaster happened. What about the year before then, I hear you ask? But anyhow, he stayed on for a whole year after everybody else had left because he thought it was perfectly safe. He had a daughter who lived with her husband in Tokyo and had a couple of children. She left Japan and emigrated to New Zealand with her family because she thought the level of radiation in Tokyo was too dangerous. That's within just one family. And so in not struggling back to the question, my biggest takeaway is that the psychological impact of this disaster has done infinitely more harm than the ionizing radiation released from the plant.
Very interesting. Thank you so much. So the next question comes from Mark Su. With the release of the wastewater from Fukushima, it seems hard for Japan to allay fears from China and South Korea about radiation problems. The other problem I've seen with fake exaggerated news about it, what other steps can Japan do aside from inviting Chinese and Korean researchers to monitor Fukushima? I've heard that this is a step that Tokyo is taking in the news.
Right. Well, actually, in the case of Korea, the current president is a very unusually sympathetic to Japan and has refrained from banning all seafood from Japan. The more violent reaction has come from China, and I don't really know if there's much more that the government can do. I mean, how about Prime Minister Kishida going to Fukushima and drinking a couple of pints of it? That might help possibly, but really the facts are all there. The science is there. The World Health Organization accepts the Japanese position on this, and so asking how to persuade China to take a more moderate view of the matter is a bit like asking how to make members of the Republican Party stop believing that the 2020 election was stolen. You know, some people, once they have these entrenched beliefs, it's extremely difficult to prise them away from them.
Thank you very much. The next question comes from John Mincing. Do you think that there was a way to avoid the disaster through better disaster management, such as helicoptering and emergency generators or some such?
There's always room for improvement. I think I don't know if we're talking about disasters in general or nuclear disasters in particular here, but well, in the case of nuclear disasters, you know, if people haven't learned the lessons about where to put your backup generators from the Fukushima disaster, they should all be fired if they haven't been already. Other than that, well, you know, it's important to have the best possible equipment. But what's also very important, and was in another tragic failure in the case of Fukushima, is you have to use it properly, like the speedy monitoring system. The Japanese government had a vast amount of detailed information about where the radiation plume was going, and they didn't use it. It reminds me of things like the Kobe earthquake back in 1995, when the government refused to accept help from the US military, largely because Hyogo Prefecture, where Kobe is located, had a very left-wing anti-US military base government. This time, the Japanese authorities did allow the US military to help out, famously in Operation Tomodachi, and I'm glad they were willing to put their nationalist pride to one side for that. But yeah, it's not just what you've got, it's how you use it.
Thank you. Jun Tran Hui said, from the late 20th, early 21st centuries until now, the world is moving towards using nuclear energy. But two nuclear disasters, Chernobyl in 1986, caused by humans, and the Fukushima disaster in 2011, caused by natural disasters, made me wonder whether nuclear energy is safer than traditional energy sources. And in your opinion, what is the biggest lesson learned after the 2011 nuclear disaster in Fukushima? Thank you so much.
I take it that you don't think that nuclear energy is particularly safe, and if that's so, well, I agree with you. You know, there's a famous journalist in Britain called George Monbiot, Monbiot. He writes on environmental issues for The Guardian, a liberal left-leaning newspaper, and he's a kind of hero of environmentalists, or he was, until about 7 or 8 years ago, when he changed sides and decided that nuclear power was actually better than other forms of energy generation, or had a place in the mix because of the greater risks from carbon emissions from other kinds of power plants. I understand why he changed his position there. I haven't changed my own position. I think that the long-term goal has to be to switch over entirely to renewable energy, and in my view, it's far from impossible to do that. The biggest challenge, as you may know, strangely enough, is developing good enough batteries. The battery, that's a technology that's been around for over 100 years. And yet, what's the biggest thing I worry about with my high-tech smartphone? Has it got enough battery left? And the same applies to saving energy generated by wind and solar power, because of course you can't generate it at night with a solar power or when the wind isn't blowing. So I would like to see a massive research drive into battery technology in particular and renewable energy in general. If the will was there, I believe it could be done.
Thank you so much, Professor Gill. Do you have time for 2 more quick questions?
Sure.
Thank you so much. Excuse my voice. So one of the questions comes from Mr. Lance Gatling. What do you attribute the adverse psychological impact other than the Japanese government and random loons on the net?
Well, okay, so radiation is scary. It's invisible. You don't know where it is, and most people who haven't got a PhD in physics don't really know that much about how it works. There's the different kinds, beta, gamma, etc., etc. What you don't understand is scary to an extent that's natural. It's invisible. It's fascinating to compare radiation with the coronavirus, another invisible airborne threats that actually affected Japan just a few years after the Fukushima disaster. So I think it's natural to be scared of radiation, but I think things were made worse by people who were trying to help. You know, especially the left here in Japan and environmental movements, the likes of Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth. They wanted to support the people of Fukushima by emphasizing how badly they'd been victimized by the government and how badly their lives had been affected. Unfortunately, by doing that, they made the whole of Japan think how dangerous and scary a place Fukushima might be, and this created discrimination against Fukushima people and unnecessary panic and just made things worse in many different ways. If you're interested, check out my academia.edu page. I have a few papers on the Fukushima problem there, and one of them is called Anti-Nuclear Agitprop Art, and it discusses cartoons about the Fukushima nuclear disaster that made it seem as though Fukushima was some sort of hellhole, and you know, that's where a lot of the blame for the psychological stresses lies, I believe. About half with the government and TEPCO, the other half with progressive people who thought they were trying to support the people of Fukushima, but unfortunately made them seem like inhabitants of hell.
Thank you so much. And the final question comes from Simon Werne. Can you tell us how Nagadoro has changed? My recent visit shocked me.
Matthew, you actually visited Nagadoro?
It's from Simon.
Pardon? Simon. Okay, well, so in that case, you'll know what Nagadoro looks like now. It basically looks like a kind of moonscape, because all but a handful of the houses have been demolished. There used to be some 80 or so houses there, all but 4 or 5 would have been demolished. Instead we have a sort of empty area, and here and there huge piles of the black plastic bags full of contaminated soil, and you know, why would anybody want to live there? There aren't any shops. You know, the whole of Iitate village, that's Nagadoro and 19 other settlements, has got one convenience store, no supermarket, uh, 3 restaurants, 1 clinic, 1 school, and that's about it. And the area, an area bigger than Osaka, before the disaster, it was already struggling to survive, 6,000 people. Now we're looking at 1,500 people. In Japanese, this is called a genkai shuraku, meaning a community on the brink of just disappearing or being abandoned. And sadly, I think it's all too likely that that will happen to many of these communities in Fukushima. And ironically, that is exactly the opposite of what the government decontamination program was supposed to achieve. Very, very sad.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Gill, for your presentation today and taking time out of your day to be with us. This concludes our Q&A session. And once again, thank you to our program sponsor, the Japan Foundation, New York. Everyone for joining us tonight. Thank you again, Professor Gill, for your wonderful presentation. And thank you to our audience for very, very interesting conversations in the chat. We hope you will join us again next week for more YCAPS events. Thank you so much.
Right, and always happy to argue about this with people, and I expected to be given a tougher time, actually. You've been a very nice audience. Thank you.